I totally felt this isn't for me. Therapy isn't for me. I'm never going to do this again. It caused me to feel even more hopeless. And this is why I advocate for professional mental health care so strongly.
Hey everyone, welcome back. It's Dr. Drew Ramsey. Thanks for joining me for another episode. This is a special one because I have a really dear friend, fellow psychiatrist, Greg Scott Brown. Greg's also a fellow author. The Self-Healing Mind is his book, and he's an affiliate faculty member at Dell Medical School in Austin, Texas. And he's been a co-collaborator, co-conspirator, good friend, shrink brother when it comes to all things mental health and male mental health. So Greg, welcome. Thanks for joining me for an episode to talk about you and mental health and anything else that comes up.
Thank you so much for having me, Drew. Congratulations on the podcast.
Thank you. I thought it was time. We've been talking all about it and in a bunch of different formats, and I just wanted to go ahead and at least get one started. Seems like a really nice format to connect with people. And also because you and I are in the listening profession and in the talking, I'm hoping that these conversations can help people get into some really interesting aspects of mental health and mental fitness and also the inspiring aspects. Because your story is very inspiring to me. I've known you for a while, and I wanted you to come on early because you were one of the first guests on Friday Sessions, and now you co-host that with me. This great series. We have almost 100 conversations about male mental health. But Greg, maybe we would just start. I was wondering if you could just introduce yourself to everybody just in your words, and besides what I just said, kind of who you are, where you are, how you're thinking about things right now.
Right. So I'm an integrative psychiatrist, which essentially means that I'm not just prescribing medications and doing talk therapy like you, Drew. I believe there's a role for nutrition and mind-body medicine movement when it comes to improving our mental health and making sure that we're staying mentally fit. My story is one that actually, I experienced depression when I was in my early 20s. During that time, I had a hard time really connecting with a therapist or psychiatrist. I just didn't feel comfortable. One of those early therapy sessions that, I was actually a patient. I ended up walking out of that therapy session. It's something that I shared with you. And that's really, influenced my role in the way that I see mental health care today. I think that psychiatrists and therapists definitely need to do a better job of connecting with our patients, sharing our stories, being vulnerable ourselves when we can, because I think that allows patients to see us as human and realize that, we're kind of all in this together. We're all trying to figure ourselves out.
Yeah, I love being on this journey with you, Greg. You really helped me, settle into something about middle-aged, working with you. It's been really just a wonderful experience. Can you just take us back to that moment? Are you in New York at this moment, everyone? So, Greg, you also are an accomplished musician. I mean, you were at Juilliard for a little while.
In my past life, I was. So I did spend some time at Juilliard, but this was right around the time that I left Juilliard. I would say it probably started towards the end of that time when I was at Juilliard, but I ended up coming back to Houston. I transferred from Juilliard about halfway in to the program. I was having some symptoms of burnout that probably was what led to depression. But I was in Houston at the time, really trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. Like so many people in that transitional stage, early to mid 20s, and it was difficult for me. And, I eventually ended up, going down this long journey to medical school and becoming a psychiatrist. But, it's definitely something that, was a challenge for me. And looking back, Drew, I'll tell you this, it's an experience that at this point in my life, I'm grateful for. I think I learned so much about myself through that mental health journey. I learned about, what makes me tick, what's important for me. I've learned to find gratitude in the small things in my life today. And, even as, future challenges have presented themselves to me today, I think that I've learned to handle them a little bit better because of that experience.
Yeah, it's interesting how we learn these things, how hard it is at the time. And especially, I think, were younger and struggling with their mental health.
Right.
Now with like the wisdom of some decades and a lot of skills and a lot of tools, I still find that more mental health challenges, and I've even found some unique ones, I would say, in parenthood and aging and I don't know, middle age is in both in great ways, not what it's cracked up to be. I mean, really, like a wonderful time, but also I think there are parts where you run into it like, wow, man, I don't really know about that. Like, huh? It's an interesting time.
And people are asking themselves these questions, I think, at different ages now. So I came across, there's a book called The Quarter Life Crisis. I don't know if you came across that
Mm-hmm.
book, right? I mean, so you have folks in their 40s and 50s and also younger people in their mid 20s and early 30s who are asking themselves these big questions. What's the purpose of my life? Where am I going? What's this all about? And I think it's important that we address that as well.
Yeah, and I also this notion that there's a crisis. I mean, and maybe I'm too much of an optimistic psychiatrist, but I really think, especially this notion that I should be having a midlife crisis right now, I really think of this notion of incredible opportunity in middle life. And I think the same thing when I'm working with patients in their 20s that it can feel like a crisis, but it's there's so much kind of around you and in front of you, and seeing those opportunities and giving yourself permission to explore them. I want to go back to that. Can we go back to? I mean, it's a little personal. You've been very open. I mean, yeah, but I want to go back to this session and this notion that you are struggling with your mental health. You're a young Black man in Texas. It sounds like back in Houston, and you go in to see a therapist, and it's so upsetting to you, you leave. And it's just remarkable now thinking how many hours, thousands of hours, you've sat in session with people, making sure that doesn't happen. Can you tell us what happened in that moment? Because I think so many people, that's how they feel in therapy. Just like, oh, I tried it.
And I should say, since then, I've also been a therapy patient myself, right? So I've kind of learned how to accept therapy in a way that maybe I wasn't open to receiving it back then. But I'll just tell you my experience in that session. I was very depressed. I was very depressed. I was feeling hopeless. I remember sitting there on the couch. It felt like a very stale kind of session, a checklisty person with
Kind of
the
going through
clipboard.
symptoms. You've been feeling irritable. You've been feeling hopeless.
Right,
That
just
kind
going through the questions, and I didn't really feel a connection there. And the thing is, it's not to say that the therapist was doing anything wrong per se. I mean, this person was doing an intake, and that's people have different styles of doing that. But what I would offer to patients at this point is, like any relationship, give it some time. I mean, we know that there's this thing called therapeutic alliance, right? The connection that you feel with your therapist, and like any relationship, that's important. And it wouldn't necessarily be something that you'd expect to happen right away. Now, if you're 5 or 6 sessions in with your therapist and you're still not feeling that, I wouldn't say that that's just an opportunity to get up and leave. But maybe ask a question, or bring up this idea. Hey, I was hoping that we'd cover these particular areas, and don't feel uncomfortable, introducing those ideas into that therapy session.
It's so hard to do when we first meet someone. And I think so often people see us as physicians, authority figures, the person who's going to try and get them sober or tell them what to do. And I think there's so many misperceptions about psychiatry specifically, that we're going to put on medicines. So that's our only move. I mean, that's where you and I really, this word integrative um, is really important. And also this notion of therapeutic alliance. It's so central to how we work clinically in mental health that I think is confusing for people. And thinking about it is one of the roles when we're in mental health. And I think so all, not just, I would say patients, but I kind of think that's a lot of us who are working on our mental health, really understanding how to work on that alliance and talk about it, I think is confusing for people. The idea of being in a quote unquote therapeutic relationship and saying, hey, it felt like we ran a checklist last time, and I'm feeling a need for an emotional connection right now.
And the thing is, I mean, I don't know about your training, but I think this is pretty universal. Psychiatrists and therapists, I mean, we're kind of trained to have uncomfortable, awkward, weird conversations about like anything. So I think it would be really hard to offend a psychiatrist or a therapist. So,
Well, I would think also to people, if you do, like, if you lose your, if you're, can I say that on my podcast? If you, can you say that on my podcast? Like FCC, but if you lose your stuff, in case my dad's listening, if you get upset, if you get defensive, I mean, patients note that with me, like, no, you got really upset. And I dwell on those moments like that. Is important to feel. But one of the people say, why aren't you more reactive? Why aren't you saying more? It's that you're thinking about that, and kind of more than thinking about, feeling about what that experience is. So that if you do offend us in the mental health room, I mean, that's a good therapist really takes note of that and realizes, oh, I got something triggered in me. I got some work to do, because we're not there to judge.
We're not there to judge. And and it's something to talk about too, right? And so, and I mean, I don't know if you've had this experience, but I've been working with a patient. It's happened a couple of times in my career so far. And my patient is telling me something that is so emotional, so sad, that sometimes it brings tears to my eyes. And I find myself, crying with my patient in a therapy session. It's happened a couple of times in my career.
I really appreciate you mentioning that. I mean, just, I don't know, for all the stigma around that, both within our profession, that like having emotions and being emotionally connected to our patients, to our work, is somehow like, and I don't know how you do it any other way.
I mean, we're not robots. We're humans too.
And also, as you said, it's the place to have those conversations that you can't have other places.
Right.
Where, and in that, hopefully that framework we create, I get very concerned when patients point out, oh, it's a little hard to say this to you.
Right.
Quickly, like, I want to understand, like, what, in some ways, like a little bit like what can I do better? And what has happened so far to create an environment where you just can't share anything with me. I mean, that's really the point of it. In some ways, to create that frame, see what happens from there.
But the point is, I mean, that's the place to talk about. That's a place to acknowledge our emotions as therapists, for patients to acknowledge their emotions. That therapy session, the way I think of it, it's a safe space.
You walked out of that first session. I'm sure that you went through the checklist. Did you just kind of say, this isn't working for me, stand up and walk out?
I left. I stood up and I left. And I never, that's someone I never went back to.
And do you remember what you're feeling? I mean, it feels like it's so hard for people to take that step and go have an evaluation. And then to have it not work out, which, I had an evaluation last week. I wouldn't say the person felt like I was, as good as I hope I can be. Sometimes we just don't connect. Sometimes we're not at the top of our game. I mean, it happens. But you remember what you're feeling? Because, I mean, if you really taken some time to take that step.
I mean, I'll tell you, during that period of my life, I obviously was not a psychiatrist. I hadn't been to medical school, wasn't as psychologically minded as I was now. But I would say that my experience at that particular point in my life is not unlike, the tens of millions of people in the United States who are struggling with depression or anxiety, as I was back then too. And so, I mean, I totally felt, this isn't for me. Therapy isn't for me. I'm never going to do this again. And it caused me to feel even more hopeless. Now, thankfully, Drew, I didn't become a statistic, and I realized I could have, right?
What helped you? What helped you do that? Is you're descending into depression? You're hoping to get some help. You've been. I mean, what did you play again?
I honestly feel like, I mean, this is why I advocate for professional mental health care so strongly. I feel like it was a lot of luck. My family was there. They were smothering me with love. I mean, a lot of people don't have that. And I feel like that's part of the reason why there are, 140 suicides on average every day in the United States. Right. And so, going back, I totally wish that I would have stuck with it. I think that would have made things a lot easier over the next several months. But, thankfully things did turn around and get better for me.
Can you share a little how that happened? I mean, you found so much. You're going from It sounds like a trajectory to be a professional musician. Was it? I always get this wrong. I feel, is it the oboe you played at Juilliard?
I was an oboist, right?
An
And
oboist,
so
right?
at this time, I'd left Juilliard,
It's
and
such a
I was.
big decision for a musician. When you don't end up at Juilliard, like, like maybe I'll play the oboe. Oh, I'm pretty good at this. Like that's thousands of hours of practice and focus, and going
It,
towards
it,
being a professional musician, I would guess.
it is, but I'll tell you, I mean, burnout is a very, very real thing, right? I mean, and just feeling like you're in over your head, questioning your identity, at a certain point, wondering, what am I even doing here? How am I going to make a living from this? I mean, spending 7 days a week, weekends, holidays, evenings, not taking any break. I mean, and that can spiral into depression, right? And so I think that at a certain point, I wanted to check out, and I did. I gave up a scholarship at Juilliard, ended up coming back to Houston, which I saw as a safe space. It's where I grew up. My family was here, and essentially gave up on all of that to start over, right? And I thought again that was going to be easy, right? That process was going to be easy. It wasn't. It was really hard. It was one of the most difficult
How do you think that
transitions
would be
I've
easy?
ever
Just
made.
because you were burned out, you're done with the oboe, you're done with New York, you're
Yeah.
ready to move on from that, and the notion that the kind of thing that you were stepping into was
Mhm.
going to relieve the depression because you were leaving
Right.
this trajectory that you'd been on that you realized
Right.
not for
Right. I mean, that's right. I mean, I see that a lot in my patients as well. It's like, we feel like we're in over our head, and we're like, well, if I just do this one thing, if I step away, if I quit my job, um, if I end this marriage or whatever it may be, then things are going to get better, right? If I just do this
me.
one thing, and then when they don't, sometimes that can make us feel even worse. And so, I just think, again, that's why it's important. Anytime someone is feeling that way, whether it's burned out or they're feeling depressed or they're feeling worthless or guilty, for them to take a few moments, slow down a bit, talk to someone about it, connect with someone that they trust, and make sure that they're in that right headspace before they're making a decision like that could totally upend their life.
Yeah, I think it's. I wonder what would have happened if if somehow you would have gone to the Juilliard Counseling Center. I'm just racking my brain here because the head of Juilliard Mental Health is a Columbia psychiatrist who I think it was a year ahead of me in residency. And I can't remember his name because I'm at that point in my aging. I can see his face though, which and I'll remember his name, put him in the show notes. But I wonder if you would have bumped into him. One whether we wouldn't have gotten you in psychiatry, which would just be, and I would, you have any thoughts on that? What it would have been
I
like?
do. I mean, it's something, Drew, that I think about often. But I'm also someone who believes that everything happens for a reason. I think that, again, I'm able to look at that experience in my life, and I can spend the next 20 years questioning what if, what if, what if. But I believe things happen the way that they were supposed to happen. I couldn't imagine doing anything other than I'm doing right now. And again, I'm able, Drew.
Let's go with this. I mean,
I am able to look at that experience again at this point in my life, and as weird as this sounds, I'm able to look at it and find gratitude in it. It wasn't a fun experience. It was a miserable experience. I wouldn't want to relive that experience. Am I grateful that it happened? Did I learn from it? Absolutely.
it's that climb up the mountain that as it's arduous, we kind of romanticize it. The kind of that gaining wisdom is something other than painful.
Mm.
And so often it's just really it's those arduous times, those
Mhm.
challenging times, in some ways, as those very scary times.
Mhm.
And then it's just such a wonderful transition how you then joined. I was just thinking about when this was, because I was wondering whether I was like a somewhat depressed resident
Yeah.
wandering this all around Lincoln Center, and these moments where if you're tracking us, that we were within feet of each other.
Yeah.
I'm sure
Yeah.
Lincoln Center is your
Right.
furiously rehearsing, and I'm wandering around, wondering about, I don't know, mental health, psyche as an intern, sleep deprived. We were very close, I'm sure.
We were. And I'll tell you this just to add a little bit, Drew. So one of my favorite conversations, I don't know if you've seen this, I think it's on YouTube, is a conversation about loss and grief between Anderson Cooper and Stephen Colbert. And I don't remember whether it's Colbert or Cooper in that conversation, but one of those guys basically said, you have to learn to love the worst thing that's happened to you. And when I first heard that, I'm like, what are they talking about? I mean, how can you love the worst thing that's happened to you? But that's kind of how I view this depressive episode uh, in my life, right? I mean, even people who have endured great trauma. They were abandoned by their dad or their mom when they were young, and then because of that, it teaches them, okay, this is what I don't want to do, and they're going to be all in when it comes to being a dad or a mom. They're not going to repeat those mistakes, and maybe they wouldn't have had that opportunity to learn how to be such a great parent if that hadn't happened to them. My dad, Drew, you don't know this. My dad never knew his father. He never knew his father. And because of that, again, my dad is probably the most amazing father to me that a son could have. Right. And again, I think somehow being able to find a valuable lesson in his experience as a child so that he doesn't repeat those same mistakes with me is something that he's had to learn over the years that I think a lot of people can benefit from if they're able to appreciate that.
How do you think your dad learned to be such a good and present dad?
Yeah. Well, I think it's all about reflecting on his experience. He knew what he did not want to give me, right? He knew that he wanted to be present in my life because it's something he didn't have, right? And so,
Yeah, I'm thinking about that. I guess in my own experience in fatherhood, of also wanting that and having had a present dad. You sort of triangulating what of that experience worked and was great, what didn't, what you're going to do differently. But you're kind of triangulating from something. And I was just thinking about in that absence of a father. It's because you guys are really close. I see you on Instagram.
we're very close. I mean, I think it's easy to sit there and repeat the past, repeat past mistakes, right? Um, but I think if you're intentional about it, like I don't use a clipboard in my initial evaluations. I try my hardest not to be checklisty because I know what it feels like to be on the other side. And that's not something that was palatable for me. And so I'm very intentional about not doing that, even though it was an undesirable experience that I had. So I think there's a lot to be learned from these mistakes of the past.
I think it's also one of those things as we spend a lot of hours in the clinical chair. You and I have both been doing this for a long time. That ability to note when someone is uncomfortable and feeling that. What was different when I was first, it's like when you're early shrink and someone starts to sob or cry, and it's a little uncomfortable in a way that it doesn't feel like that to me now. It feels much more sacred, much more like really being with someone, and they're allowing you to do that. So it's really it's one of those pieces, as you know, that from our own experiences we take into our work.
Right, right. I mean, and the thing is, I think when it does happen, again, like I mentioned earlier, I mean, what I was taught to do and what I have done is just acknowledge it. I mean, what you're saying is, it sounds like that was a really difficult experience for you. I'm right here. I'm feeling it, with you. And I've noticed that when that does happen, I mean, patients, they tend to appreciate that the person sitting across from them is an empathetic human being. And we're not just a robot taking notes here and waiting to see our next patient.
Can we talk a little bit more about fatherhood and tips that you feel from your experience with your dad? I don't know why. I'm sort of, it's one of those things as we were heading into this, I wanted to ask you about. And then I realized I do want to hear about some of the actionables from your book. But I am curious just on you know, your notions and ideas around what are the actions you see your dad taking that really creates closeness and consistency in your relationship.
And I think that that's the word, consistency, right? So I talk to my dad every day, even if it's for 2 minutes. He'll call or I'll call. I mean, we make some sort of contact. Um, and I live 20 minutes from my dad. I don't see him all the time, but at least hearing his voice and making that contact really helps. Um, for those important moments, the birthdays and the holidays, we try our very best to see each other and spend time with each other, right? Um, and really being able to have important conversations too. Like my dad, he will ask me about things that are going on in my life. I'll ask him about things that are going on in his life. But again, I think the most important thing for someone who is maybe struggling with a relationship with their dad and wanting to improve that is that consistency element. And you wouldn't just have to wait for it to come from your dad or from your son. I think it's a symbiotic thing. It's a mutual thing, right?
I really love that activity of the self that this book is the self-healing mind, and I think part of that notion and part of your message is around not externalizing. And many of us can help you with your mind. Lots of people have written and thought about it. People who inspire you have been through various things similar to yours, but that ability, as Greg's noting, if you want a better relationship with the father of a son, setting that as an intention and then consistently working towards it is the way that those things happen.
And then also realizing that no one's perfect. There's no perfect father-son relationship. There's no perfect marriage. There's no perfect friendship. Uh, you're going to be imperfections in those relationships. And so I think just giving yourself time and space to appreciate that, if an effort is being made, even if it's an imperfect effort, it's still an effort, right? And finding gratitude in that.
My analyst said something to me as we were becoming parents way back, like a decade ago, that always stuck with me, where it was around the notion of failing as a parent, and I was really distressed about it. And I was like, oh, I just don't want to fail as a parent. And he said, well, how do you think it works? And this notion that in the things that I am unable to understand, maybe, or provide, gosh, hopefully not, but probably at some point, or be present for, because it's not appropriate. Some things are, some things aren't, right, as a dad. So that those are going to be these like amazing moments of growth and formation of the self. Like and so as you know that not being perfect in some ways is one of those pieces of relationship that we struggle with so much, or maybe not even perfect, but those parts of someone that oftentimes I think cause us to deconstruct relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so and so's a little greedy, or like, oh, so and so said this thing, or
Yeah.
I was feeling, I went out and they were really this or that,
Yeah.
and we kind of, I don't know. I think it's hard in some ways to maintain that consistency we were talking about these days for people.
Yeah. I mean, I think consistency is a thing that drives success in any area of our life, right? And so just sticking with it and continuing to move forward.
Greg, tell us a little bit about your book, The Self-Healing Mind. This came out,
It
I saw
came
a
out
birthday
1 year ago.
1 year ago, right?
Yeah,
So is it,
1 year
yeah.
ago.
So
Just celebrated its
congratulations.
1 year birthday. So the self-healing mind, it's all about evidence-based self-care. So sleep, spirituality, nutrition, breath work, movement. These are actually things when I was in my early 20s, when I was struggling with depression, that I serendipitously happened upon. I mean, that's one of the earliest yoga classes that I went to. I found that after I did a yoga class, I felt a little bit better that I had before I went. And that was a feeling that lingered on for a few days. So I kept going back. And I found that, that experience of moving my body, of breathing intentionally, being around people, was something that really really helped me. I mean, I'll tell you this, Drew. I had no idea that yoga had been studied or breath work had been studied or there was any type of evidence for moving your body that could help with some forms of depression or anxiety. I wouldn't know that until many years later. All I knew was in that moment, I felt better. So it was something that piqued my interest.
I feel like sometimes, Greg, we I don't know, it's because we've known each other for a while, or we are brothers in psychiatry, and maybe that feels beyond race in some way. But I feel like sometimes I don't, uh, we don't talk about race in a way, in terms of it. Just I'm thinking about you going into this yoga class and thinking again, that's a you're transcending a lot of things culturally, racially. You going into therapy, even that time you walk out. Let's just, I doubt that you're seeing the black therapist in that environment.
You're right. You're right. And I'll tell you this. I mean, um, one of my favorite interviews that I've done was several years ago. I interviewed Chris Isom and Alec Brownridge, are two friends of mine in Austin. They're Black Americans. They're educators. They're yoga teachers. And they were at the time leading a yoga for men workshop in Austin, which kind of combines everything that you just mentioned. So the first half of the workshop was movement. The second half of the workshop, we break up into small groups. Men from different cultural and ethnic, racial backgrounds, and we talk on a Saturday morning about our relationships and our jobs and just how things were going in life. I mean, and it was a really great opportunity to just shatter some of that, dismantle some of that stigma and some of those preconceived notions about who does yoga, who talks, who goes to therapy. And it was a really great time.
In some ways, are you feeling that as you kind of connected, it sounds like emotionally and relationally about meaningful stuff with these men in their lives, it transcended some of those biases? You're talking to people that, you have that initial sense of, you see something, you expect something because of the biases we all have, and then you heard something very different.
Absolutely. I mean, and there were people there again at the time when I was going to this workshop. I'd been doing yoga for years, but there's some people there who had never done anything like that before. We were just invited because it's someone that we knew, was a friend of ours, and they wanted to come and check it out. I mean, thankfully, they were open enough to actually come into the workshop. But I mean, for anyone out there who's listening, I mean, maybe you're a person of color, and you're like, this stuff isn't for me. This therapy stuff isn't for me. Yoga's not for me. You've heard me say this a million times, Drew. Curiosity before judgment, right? It's so.
Yeah, that's one of our favorite kind of Friday sessions quotes. And I saw originally that idea. There was a great quote by Walt Whitman that's going to escape me, but that I think is one of the original kind of American uses of that notion of really. He said it quite eloquently and quite early American. But this notion of, let us put our curiosity before our judgment. Like that's how we learn and explore and grow, and also just don't become set in our ways. I think that's such a tension for all of us. How do I defend these things I know is good, like this way that I've been doing it, however that is, that I like, that works for me, that I'm familiar with, and at the same time be open to challenges
Mhm.
and new ways of doing things. I think that's a
And
really
that requires unlearning, right? So our society puts such a high premium on learning. We need to learn this, learn this, learn this, learn this. But when we're set in certain ways of thinking, I mean, we also need to unlearn some of the things that we thought were benefiting us, right? In order to, create more space to learn a different way of thinking. And so, I mean, that's something we should be intentional about.
I feel like the only time I've actually done that, Greg's, when like a girlfriend broke up with me. I'm trying to think of other times I was like conscious about that, where I had to like really unlearn something,
Yeah.
and it's a really nice way of framing it, right? That part of new behaviors, part of maybe setting new boundaries, isn't just the learning of those skills; it's the unlearning of something. it's a really great way to phrase it. I haven't phrased it that way, but so often in therapy, I think that's what we're deconstructing something where it's sort of like, oh, you're having a trauma response and you're being in service of everyone, right? Or I was speaking with someone recently, a patient asked about like, why am I creating so much drama? There's like this great, like, before like stopping that, I'm like, oh yeah, like what is motivating that? You see me like, like that's the interest of, I think, mental health professionals is really like understanding consciously, unconsciously what motivates those kind of things for us.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
Craig, I just want to go back to your book for a minute. You said evidence-based self-care, and then you said spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's
I'm
something.
glad you asked. Yeah.
Well, a lot of men struggle with that. I mean, just
Yeah.
we're talking about your, in some ways, just being such a wonderful both friend but inspiration to me, and how you so gracefully transcend and talk about and make us comfortable talking about so many of these things.
What does spirituality mean to you?
I think to me, spirituality means, for me, a healing process of being someone, probably like a lot of people listening. I would say in some ways had like a lot of, I'm going to call it religious trauma. I'm the kind of therapist, like some people are like, trauma with a big T and trauma with a little t. And I'm not really like that. I feel like that's quite stigmatized. If you had a neglectful like parent, I'm not going to rate that. I'm like, oh, not a big T, because I see how people really struggle with some of those, some of those things. So for me, I think the spirituality is a process of, in some ways, recovering from a little bit of trauma. Some transgenerationally, my family, my mother's family is Jewish, and I would say was Jewish in the sense really kind of lost that, having lost most of that branch of the family or the majority of it in the Holocaust, and 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 so marrying into a family that was Presbyterian, that had very strong faith, was both unfamiliar but really like curious. I remember being in medical school and going to church with my wife's family. I remember particularly one Christmas Eve. It was like snowing, and I was like in my mid-20s, very in love. And the church was lit up with candles, and everybody was singing. And I just had this thing of like, where else do human beings get together and sing? In a way to sing to like and use these words that we don't really use or think about so much, angels, right? And thinking about the waves, and thinking about the spirit, and thinking about embracing each other. And so I think to me, spirituality is around a very personal and often individual relationship that also I think at its best is communal. Like feeling the spirit with other people is such a, wow, wonderful thing. And it's something, that personal part of understanding. A woman I work with who's an artist talks about, that thinking of ourselves in some ways as portals or antennas for something in the universe. And so I think about that's bigger than us. And so I think about spirituality on an individual level as our efforts and our experiences as we reach out to touch that and to channel that and to find those moments, and also pay attention to those moments where we're transcending something about that default mode network neurotic human experience, and we're leaning into something bigger. And so, to me, that's spirituality, which I think often for people gets wrapped up in and works very well for them to think about that in terms of religion. And that's really where billions of people kind of access this and have a framework. And then I think for a lot of us, where there's maybe a mix of traditions in our past, I think that idea of spirituality, whether that's, as you said, taking breaths. I find a lot of spirituality to me often I find was quickly in my breath. I find in my relationships. I think one of the reasons that I love being a therapist is there's just something incredibly spiritual, like to me, about the work. There's something about with this resurgence of psychedelic medicine, and I'm very, very interested in that, doing a little of that. I think it's all that great, but I kind of had this little bit of contrarian feeling of like I'm in like a non-ordinary state of consciousness my whole career, because the therapy room is a little bit non-ordinary state. It's not the kind of normal thing, and so it feels very spiritual to me that sitting with and processing and helping individuals take those next steps in their lives.
So, Drew, I came to notice that when I would ask my patients that question that I asked you, I mean, it's like one of the most provocative conversation starters in a therapeutic session. I mean, my patients just love that question. I mean, they would react to it. I mean, some would say, "Oh, so you're talking about religion?" And I would reframe it. What do you think it is? And they would just share these beautiful stories, um, from their past, or some would actually talk about it in terms of religion. But I think the most important thing, I mean, even in what you just shared with me, the way I would frame that is spirituality is all about connection, right? So it could mean connecting with your inner self, connecting with people from your past. If you're religious, connecting with a higher power through God, right? Prayer, meditation, um, altruism. I mean, these are all forms of spirituality, right?
And I think the way that the consistency,
Mhm.
spirituality isn't like, oh, it's back in the season now. It's like fall. Let's put on our spirituality.
Right.
There is that, as we were talking about earlier, about consistency, that way of, I think especially when church attendance is probably down nationally, I
Mhm.
would say, and it's been trending that way. This idea of every Sunday or twice a week, every holiday, and having that consistent ritual
Mhm.
um, is really uh, something that's a key part of this. And I think sometimes without that structure, people really, or that history, people really struggle.
You mentioned the default mode network earlier. And so, I mean, for people who don't know, these series network in the brain that actually is most active in people when we're kind of like chilling out, watching TV, not doing a whole lot. But if you're anxious, overworked, stressed, burned out, it's just a lot of chatter in there, just, highly active, right? And so research has shown things like meditation, things like prayer, altruism, selfless service, volunteering. I mean, we do things like this to form those deeper, more meaningful connections, either with our inner self, our external environment, or through a higher power, whatever it may be. We're actually able to quiet activity in the default mode network. So, I mean, there is a science behind spirituality that I think we should, be aware of.
Yeah, and I think we know those moments. We always we call it like good moods or feeling euphoric or something great happened, or we're in big natures when I feel it. But those moments when, and I love that we feel connection, right? We can feel connection to many things, our partners, our family, our self, and creativity is why I love the self-healing mind, where you put the onus of this responsibility to heal, to explore, to be curious. You put that on us.
Right. So we don't have to wait. We don't have to wait for those moments to come to us, right?
Yeah, and I
So
like that also. I like, Greg, that I don't have to be. I mean, having my dependency issues and stuff, I don't have to be so just dependent on other people. And one of the things that's hard about mental health for people, and I appreciate this, is my analyst, who I adore, it is older, and and I do have. There's a sort of terror sometimes when you think about. This notion of kind of a disruption or a loss, and this kind of dependency that gets formed in some good work with individuals. And so I like the notion that you liberate us a little bit from that. Yeah, maybe there's some dependency in your life on whether that's a medication or a person or a therapist, or but in addition to that, there is the self.
right. I mean, and I want to make sure that I make that message loud and clear. I prescribe medications every day in my practice. I'm not disavowing that. I totally believe in the benefit of going to talk therapy. I mean, so I'm not saying that those things aren't important, but I'm saying that when it comes to taking care of your mental health, living with your best mental health, it doesn't stop there, right?
Well, and I think also the outcomes. I mean, I appreciate that, Greg. I think you and I are very aligned in that. And some, I think, as integrative psychiatrists, in the wellness world, I always feel a little strange to be the person who's like, "How do I become the Zoloft cheerleader?" Where we encounter people who think or feel differently about that for whatever reasons. That being in the practice of prescribing and seeing real world outcomes, it's one of the tools in our toolbox, as you know. Uh, so I appreciate that, but I also really appreciate, as a clinician and as a person, the necessary pieces beyond that we have to put in, have to be consistent about as we're talking, and that we hear them a lot. And I
Mm.
was so flattered to be in your book in the nutrition
Yes.
chapter. That was
Yeah.
just having known you for a long time, since we worked together at the APA a little bit, to hearing about this book, to seeing you get a book deal, and we should give a shout out to Joy Tutela and Karen Rinaldi and the Harper Wave team, who published both of us, and Joy represents both of us. So it's really helping us navigate the complicated world of publishing, which for a physician, I always joke, when you ask me like what I initially want to write about with nutrition, it's like we should have a chapter on omega-3s, we should have a chapter on B12, we should have a chapter on magnesium research, real cool, right? Where it says how do you fulfill someone's need? How do you create a narrative story? Is there some cool thing that happened with you and a patient in zinc? This idea that people connect to stories.
Right.
And that helps us remember and retain and be inspired and motivated. And so
most guys have cool zinc stories out eating oysters with their friends, right?
Yeah. Some people have this. I realize I'm negligent in that question. One of the nurse practitioners here in our East Jackson mental health practice asked, we were talking about evals. And we were sort of talking about doing some evals together, kind of giving each other pointers and feedback, kind of creating a framework for that. And as I've been thinking through that, there are always questions that just kind of fall away. Like I'll note sometimes, even as much as I am a nutritional psychiatrist, that it's like session 3, I haven't asked this person what they eat, and that's what they're kind of expecting somewhere early in my eval. And asking people about what spirituality means to them is something really I realize I've been negligent about, Greg. Mm-hmm. And I'm always so tickled when I find it, or when it pops up. When it's like, oh, wow, you were like a Baptist and you love to sing and you're going to go to church on that? That's amazing. That's really, but there's also a little like, wow. I usually ask them the first, is there some, because I have a first question, but it's lame. It's like in my first, just trying to get to know somebody, I ask these short questions, like, are you married? When were you born? Like, where are you from? I say, is there a cultural or religious affiliation? That's important that I know about it right now.
Well, and the thing is, Drew, again, when you shared what spirituality means to you, it can help people find their sense of purpose too. And we know that people who are living without that can feel lost, they can feel depressed, right?
Well, I also think it's a great example for everybody listening how therapy works. I had a patient who's I'm gonna say this in a level of kind of harassing me a little bit about how does therapy work. I've been coming in here. How does this work? And I think it's a great question and kind of criticism of like, one, well, how's it not working for you? Like, what doesn't feel like it's working? And then to try and fill in some of those gaps. But I've been thinking a lot about that question, kind of meditating on it. I think you just demonstrated. I'd never ever said anything probably close to like I'm in a process of self-discovery, recovering from intergenerational religious trauma because my family was killed because they were Jews. Right? I don't think I haven't really put it that way. And so, part of how talk therapy works is our putting things into words and then sitting with, in some ways, the consequences of having said it out loud, having named it, thinking about, is that true? Like, does that feel right? Like, not quite. How could I get that a little closer and understand that important part? How does this awareness, these words and ideas, how does that turn into actions for me?
And oftentimes that process takes place in between your therapy sessions, right? So, a lot of times I'll tell my patients, therapy really starts when we end this call, when you leave the clinic, right? Because what we're doing during those sessions, we're planting seeds, right? We're giving you things to think about. And in between sessions, that's when the wheels are turning, right? That's when you're asking yourself these provocative questions. That's when you're sitting down and journaling, wondering where did all of this stuff come from, right? And then you go back to your therapist and you're like, hey, for the past 2 weeks, I've been thinking about all this stuff. I've been thinking about what you said. This is what I tried. This is what worked. This is what didn't work. This is what came up. These are the emotions that I felt, right? But so much of that important work is done in between your therapy sessions.
Mm-hmm. And that framework, that consistency it's also where it's such a pleasure because, you have like this little secret project. Like I was asking my therapist, my analyst, about I know he has daughters, and so I was asking him about being a girl dad, which he's of the age he actually didn't know what that was. I was like, we're girl dads, and just kind of communication with tweens. And yeah, it's one of those, it's a very private, personal conversation about something that's really important to me. But I am kind of thinking about moments and anticipating that conversation next week to talk about that little, that kind of very personal project I have going on. How can I do this a little better? How can I understand this better? How can I sit with this feeling and do a better job with it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Greg, it's such a treat to talk with you and work with you. I feel like we have to say something about Friday sessions. And everybody, thanks for listening and hanging out with us and spending some time. I at this point, I'm still working on naming my podcast. I'm just recording it. And at first, I was thinking, I'm just going to make these 45-minute sessions because I feel that's the natural arc of my life. And I can tell this is close where I'd have a hard time holding my boundaries with you because I want to just keep talking, keep hanging out. We had such a treat after Greg and I have spent so much time together during the pandemic. And Greg's actually really one of the people who helped me the most during the pandemic. I had this idea for Friday sessions with an emailed Rich Dorment, the editor at Men's Health Magazine. And Greg was like one of the initial guests. Just we'd been working together around media and some work with the APA and had got to know each other. And then, a mix of Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, the pandemic, a lot of stuff in our personal lives. And throughout this, Greg and I were talking every week. My book wasn't done at that point. I had to finish my book in the middle of the pandemic. I had a lot of strange things happen in my personal life. And so it's been it's such a treat to be with you in a consistent way throughout this turbulent time. But then also recently we were at the American Psychiatric Association conference, both getting to present and talk about social media, but also one of my favorite memories was just doing laps with you in the exhibition hall. We're all like the kind of like, in some ways, what people say is the worst of big, lots of big farm exhibits, and they all brought these cookie ovens.
Yes.
And so I'm getting to walk around with Greg and
frozen yogurt too, right?
And frozen yogurt and fresh baked cookies. And I know this is like going to wire my brain wrong to like describe it, but I cannot. And I'm just having so much fun that I realize at some point we've done like 6 laps. I've eaten like a dozen cookies, 2 froyos, and I still just want to keep talking to Greg. So that was a really wonderful time with you, my friend.
Well, Drew, I really appreciate your friendship, and I think we've done some really amazing work together, and we are just getting started. I know there's a lot more to come. Best of luck, and I wish all the success in the world to your podcast. You're going to reach so many people, change so many lives for the better. And I'm just so happy to be able to share your company in this journey.
Well, thank you so much, Greg. I really look forward to having you back on and talking more with you. And it's wonderful knowing I've got you in my corner. It's one of the good things about being a psychiatrist, mental health professional. Is like a lot of your friends are psychiatrists, mental health professionals. So you just call them up for a casual call, and then be like, "Hey, get a little free, like a very high level advice and processing." So it's wonderful having you in my life, and I really look forward to spending more, as you say, we have a lot of time ahead of us to do more good work, to help more people reach their potential, and also for both of us to continue evolving and reaching our potentials. So it's a treat to be on this journey with you, my friend. Thanks for coming on. Everybody check out The Self-Healing Mind. We'll put a link in the show notes, and I'll see you really soon, my friend. Take care.
Take care, Drew.